In July 1572, the air over Russia didn't smell like summer. It smelled like old ash and fresh blood. Only a year earlier, the Crimean Khan, Devlet-Giray, had watched from a hilltop as Moscow, the heart of the nation, dissolved into a pillar of black smoke. He believed he hadn't just won a battle. He believed he had erased a people. So when he returned 12 months later with 120,000 riders, he wasn't looking for a war. He was looking for a harvest. He expected to find broken men begging for mercy. Instead, he found a nightmare built of timber and iron. This is not a story of a glorious charge or a heroic stand. This is the story of a mechanical massacre, a cold, calculated trap designed by a paranoid Tsar and a broken prince to turn the greatest horseman on earth into a suffocating mass of bodies. Welcome to the killing fields of Molodi. Stay with us till the end for valuable insights. Like, subscribe, and share to support the channel. The world in 1571 did not believe Russia would survive the winter. To the rest of Europe, Ivan IV was not a king. He was a failing tyrant presiding over a funeral pyre. The disaster of the previous year was not merely a military defeat, it was an existential catastrophe. When the Crimean Khan, Devlet-Giray, bypassed the southern defenses and set Moscow ablaze, he didn't just burn buildings, he incinerated the Russian state's sense of security. Thousands died in the furnace of the capital, and tens of thousands more were dragged into the long, clinking lines of the slave trade, destined for the markets of the Ottoman Empire. By the time the snow melted in 1572, the Khan was convinced that the Grand Duchy of Muscovy was a ghost. He treated Ivan like a defeated vassal, demanding the return of Kazan and Astrakhan. He sent messages of supreme arrogance, mocks the Tsar for hiding while his people burned. And his confidence was backed by terrifying numbers. As the summer heat began to bake the steppe, the Khan assembled a force that dwarfed anything the Russians could hope to muster, nearly 120,000 warriors. This wasn't just a raiding party. It was an extinction event. Inside the Kremlin's scorched walls, Ivan IV, the man history would name the Terrible, was descending into a state of vibrating, lethal paranoia. He didn't just fear the Tartars, he feared the shadows in his own halls. He believed his own nobles, the boyars, were waiting for him to bleed out so they could carve up the remains of the kingdom. To survive, he had created the Oprichnina, a brotherhood of black-clad enforcers who rode with severed dog heads on their saddles, symbols of their duty to sniff out and bite traitors. But even these black riders had crumbled when Moscow burned. The machine of terror was eating itself. Ivan knew that on open ground, his army was already dead. His best troops were tied up in the Livonian War to the west. He was bankrupt, surrounded by enemies, and losing his mind. He needed a commander who could do the impossible, and he found him in a dungeon. Prince Mikhail Vorotinsky was a man Ivan had previously arrested, tortured, and disgraced. Yet, because competent generals are rarer than loyal friends, Ivan hauled him back into service. Vorotinsky did not come back with a thirst for revenge. He came back with a cold, clinical focus. He understood the Khan's arrogance. He knew the Khan would expect the same cowardice he saw in 1571. Vorotinsky's plan was a betrayal of every knightly tradition. He wouldn't meet the horde in a glorious cavalry clash. He would build a machine. He would use the Russian forest and the Russian black powder to create a portable abattoir. As the dust from 120,000 hooves began to rise on the southern horizon, the trap was already being set near a small, insignificant village called Molodi. The strategy Mikhail Vorotinsky proposed to the Tsar was not born of bravery. It was born of a cold, mathematical necessity. He knew that the Crimean Horde lived and died by their mobility. They were the masters of the Cantabrian Circle, a swirling, fluid formation where horse archers galloped in endless loops, raining thousands of arrows onto an enemy until they dissolved into a panicked mass. To fight them on their terms was to choose a slow, agonizing suicide. Voratinsky's answer was to stop the world from moving. He would build a fortress that could travel, a wall that could breathe fire, and a trap that the Khan's pride would not allow him to ignore. This machine was the guliai-gorod, literally translated as the wandering city. While the concept of wagon forts had existed for centuries, Voratinsky weaponized it on an industrial scale. He didn't just want a defensive line, he wanted a modular killing system. He ordered the construction of massive wooden shields, each several inches thick and reinforced with iron plating to deflect the high-velocity composite arrows of the steppe. These panels were mounted on heavy-duty wagons and sledges, allowing them to be hauled across the uneven Russian terrain and bolted together in a matter of hours. The design was as brutal as it was effective. Each panel featured narrow, horizontal slits, firing ports, positioned at eye level and waist level. Behind these timber walls, the streltsy, Russia's elite musketeers, could stand in relative safety, resting their heavy matchlock muskets on the wooden ledges. They didn't need to be heroes, they only needed to be steady. A single streltsy behind a guliai-gorod panel was worth 10 men in an open field. To complement the muskets, Voratinsky integrated light field cannons, known as falconets, into the gaps between the wagons. These were not designed to sink ships, they were designed to shred meat. Packed with grapeshot and iron scraps, they could turn a charging cavalry line into a spray of red mist in a single heartbeat. But a machine is only as good as the ground it stands on. Voratinsky spent weeks scouting the southern approaches to Moscow, looking for a location that would strip the Khan of his greatest advantage, space. He found it near the village of Molodi. The terrain here was a nightmare for cavalry. To the east lay the Pakhra River, its banks soft and marshy, ready to swallow the hooves of any horse that tried to flank the Russian line. To the west were dense, ancient forests and broken ravines that made wide maneuvers impossible. Voratinsky realized that if he placed his guliai-gorod at the narrowest point of this natural corridor, the 120,000-man horde would be funneled into a kill zone barely a few hundred meters wide. As the construction teams worked, the air was thick with the smell of raw pine resin, boiling pitch, and the metallic tang of iron bolts being hammered into place. There was no music, no cheering. The men worked in a grim, focused silence. They were building their own coffins, or the instrument of their salvation. They didn't yet know which. They dug shallow trenches in front of the wagons and drove sharpened stakes into the earth at 45-degree angles, designed to disembowel horses that managed to survive the initial volleys. Meanwhile, Voratinsky began a psychological campaign. He knew Devlet Giray was a man fueled by his own legend. The Khan believed that 1571 had proven the Russians were cowards who would scatter at the first sight of a Tatar banner. So, Voratinsky fed that hunger. He sent out small sacrificial patrols of Cossacks and light cavalry. Their orders were simple: engage the Khan's scouts, exchange a few arrows, and then run. They were to look disorganized, terrified, and broken. From the Khan's saddle, the reports were exactly what he wanted to hear. The Russians were retreating. They were clustering together in a small village like cornered rats. They were hiding behind wooden fences because they were too afraid to face the steel of the horde. Every report reinforced the Khan's belief that this would be another easy year of burning and looting. He didn't see a general preparing a masterstroke. He saw a weakling trying to build a wall against a tide. He ordered his vanguard to accelerate. He wanted to be in Moscow by August. He wanted the Tsar on his knees. He didn't realize that every kilometer his horses galloped forward, they were being pulled deeper into a mechanical throat that was about to snap shut. By the morning of July 29, 1572, the air was no longer still. It vibrated with a low, rhythmic thrum, the sound of 480,000 hooves striking the dry Russian earth. From the top of the guliai-gorod's timber walls, the horizon had disappeared. In its place was a roiling, suffocating wall of yellow dust that stretched from the Pakhra River to the edge of the deep forest. The Crimean Khan's vanguard, a massive force of 20,000 elite horsemen, was the first to arrive. These were not mere raiders, they were the Nogai and Crimean heavy cavalry, men who had spent their entire lives in the saddle, capable of hitting a moving target with a composite bow from a full gallop. Devlet Giray did not hesitate. To his eyes, the Russian position looked pathetic. He saw a cluster of wagons and wooden shields hastily bolted together in the middle of a field. He saw a thin line of Russian Streltsy musketeers in their long red and blue coats, standing like targets. In the Khan's mind, a single, thunderous charge would shatter the wood, trample the peasants, and clear the road to Moscow in less than an hour. He raised his silver-mounted mace, and the war horns of the steppe screamed a single, terrifying note. The charge began as a slow trot, then a canter, then a localized earthquake. 20,000 riders surged forward, their voices rising in a synchronized war cry that had broken the spirits of armies from Poland to Persia. They loosed their first flight of arrows, a black rain that momentarily eclipsed the sun. Thousands of iron-tipped shafts hissed through the air, arching over the field and slamming into the guliai-gorod. The sound was like a million hailstone strikes. But instead of the screams of dying men, the Khan heard the dull thud of wood. The reinforced oak and pine panels, faced with thin sheets of hammered iron, caught the arrows like a pincushion. Behind the wall, the Russian soldiers didn't move. They didn't run. They didn't even fire back. They waited. Vorotinsky stood at the center of the enclosure, his hand resting on the cold bronze of a falconet. He watched the gap close. 300 meters. 200 meters. He could see the individual patterns on the Tartars' silk tunics. He could see the foam on the horses' bits. He waited until the lead riders were so close they were beginning to leap the shallow trenches he had dug. Fire! The word was lost in a detonation that felt like the world had been ripped in half. 20 cannons and 1,000 muskets erupted in a single, perfectly timed volley. Because the guliai-gorod was a solid wall, the smoke didn't dissipate, it rolled outward in a blinding, sulphurous fog. For the Crimean riders at the front, the world simply ceased to exist. Grapeshite, clusters of iron balls the size of marbles, tore through the air at supersonic speeds. It didn't just kill, it shredded. It turned horses into heaps of broken meat and riders into red mist. The momentum of the charge became its own enemy. The riders in the second and third ranks couldn't see the devastation ahead through the smoke. They kept galloping forward, only to trip over the mounting piles of their own dead. The mechanical execution had begun. Behind the timber slits, the Streltsy worked with the rhythmic precision of factory laborers. One man fired, the second man cleaned the barrel with a damp sponge, the third man measured the powder, and the fourth man seated the lead ball. They were firing at point-blank range into a mass of humanity that had nowhere to go. The narrow corridor of the Molodi field had turned the greatest cavalry on the planet into a panicked, suffocating herd. By noon, the field in front of the wandering city was no longer green. It was a landscape of threshing limbs and broken wood. The Khan, watching from the rear, felt a cold knot of realization tighten in his stomach. This wasn't the coward's fence he had imagined. It was a meat grinder. His vanguard had been decimated in less than 30 minutes, and the Russians hadn't lost a single meter of ground. But the Khan was a man of the steppe. He believed in the power of numbers. He looked at the remaining 100,000 warriors under his command and made a decision that would define the rest of the week. If the wall wouldn't break, he would drown it in blood. Devlet-Giray was no longer a conqueror. He was a man being humiliated by a wall of pine. The failure of his vanguard had sent a shockwave through the horde. For centuries, the nomadic warriors of the steppe believed that if they could see an enemy, they could kill them. But they couldn't see the Russians. They only saw the smoke, the flashes of orange flame from the timber slits, and the iron plating that turned their most expensive arrows into useless splinters. The Khan knew he had to escalate. He turned to his most disciplined and feared asset, the Ottoman Janissaries. These were the elite infantry of the Sultan, professional killers who didn't fight for loot or land, but for the cold glory of the Ottoman Empire. Unlike the Tartar horsemen, the Janissaries were masters of the firearm. They carried long-barreled muskets and heavy sabers, and they fought with a terrifying, silent mechanical precision. 7,000 of them stepped forward, their white felt caps bobbing in a sea of steel. "If the horses cannot leap the wall," the Khan commanded, "then the men must tear it down with their bare hands." The Janissaries didn't charge with a scream. They advanced in a steady, rhythmic march, their boots beating a funeral drum on the earth. Behind them, the Khan committed his heavy infantry and dismounted Nogai warriors. This was no longer a cavalry sweep. It was a siege on an open field. As they reached the kill zone, the Russian guns opened up again. But this time, the Janissaries didn't break. They stepped over the mangled corpses of the first wave, firing their own muskets into the guliai-gorod slits. The battle transformed into a localized apocalypse. The air became a thick, gray soup of sulfur and the iron scent of blood. Lead balls slammed into the wooden panels with the force of sledgehammers. Inside the wandering city, the Russian streltsy were beginning to feel the weight of the numbers. The heat inside the enclosure was rising to unbearable levels. The friction of the cannons and the constant discharge of muskets made the air burn the lungs. Men were collapsing from heat exhaustion, their faces blackened by soot until they looked like demons. Then, the Janissaries reached the wall. This was the moment Vorotinsky had feared. The wooden panels were strong, but they were held together by iron bolts and rope. Thousands of Ottoman soldiers slammed against the timber, using axes to hack at the joints and hooks to try and pull the wagons apart. They climbed over the heaps of dead horses, using the bodies as ramps to reach the top of the shields. Russian pikemen, hidden until now, stepped forward. They thrust their long steel blades through the firing slits and over the top of the panels, gutting the men who tried to scale the fortress. It was a primitive, visceral struggle. A Janissary would grab a Russian pike with his bare hands, trying to pull the defender through the gap, only to be shot at point-blank range by a musket. The mechanical execution had become a hand-to-hand massacre. The sound of the battle changed, from the roar of cannons to the wet thud of axes hitting wood and the screaming of men being crushed between the wagons. Inside the Kremlin, Ivan the Terrible was receiving frantic dispatches. He knew that if the Janissaries breached even one section of the guliai-gorod, the 100,000 horsemen waiting in the wings would pour through the gap like water through a broken dam. There would be no retreat. There would be no survivors. He sent a final message to Vorotinsky. "If you lose the wall, do not bother coming back. I will have no kingdom left to bury you in." Vorotinsky didn't need the threat. He was already standing in the blood at the base of the wagons, moving from section to section, shoving exhausted men back to their posts. He knew the Janissaries were the Khan's last clean card. If he could break their spirit here, the rest of the horde, the raiders and the vassals, would lose their stomach for the fight. But as the sun began to set on the fourth day, the wooden walls were groaning. The iron plates were glowing red from the heat of the fire. and the Russian ammunition was beginning to run dangerously low. The morning of August 2nd, 1572, began with a silence so profound it felt like the earth itself was holding its breath. Inside the guliai-gorod, the remaining Russian defenders stood like statues of soot and dried blood. They had reached the end of their endurance. Their powder flasks were empty, their tongues were swollen from thirst, and their eyes were fixed on the horizon, waiting for a signal that seemed like it would never come. Devlet-Giray, sensing that the Russian spirit had finally evaporated, ordered the final, absolute assault. He didn't send a vanguard this time. He sent the entire horde. 100,000 riders and thousands of janissaries surged forward in a tidal wave of steel and silk. They didn't care about the trenches or the stakes anymore. They were riding over a carpet of their own dead, using the mounds of carcasses as ramps to leap their horses directly onto the wooden wagons. The wandering city was being swallowed by a sea of enemies. At that exact moment, a single horn blast echoed from the hills behind the Khan's headquarters. It wasn't a Russian signal for retreat, it was a scream of vengeance. Mikhail Vorotinsky, leading a select force of heavy cavalry and elite Cossacks, exploded out of the tall grass and the hidden ravines like a ghost coming back to life. They had circled the entire battlefield under the cover of darkness, and now they were slamming into the Khan's unprotected rear. The effect was not tactical, it was psychological. To the Crimean warriors, who believed the Russians were dying of famine inside the wooden cage, the appearance of a fresh, aggressive cavalry force in their rear felt like black magic. A panicked cry went up through the ranks. The Tsar is here with a new army. Vorotinsky didn't give them time to think. He drove his heavy riders straight toward the Khan's golden tent, their lances leveling like a row of iron teeth. At the same time, the broken men inside the guliai-gorod found a final, impossible reservoir of strength. They threw open the heavy timber gates they had spent a week defending and poured out into the field, swinging axes and heavy sabers with the desperation of men who had already accepted their deaths. The Crimean horde, caught between the fire-breathing wall and the ghost army in their rear, collapsed into pure, mechanical chaos. The very numbers that had made them invincible now became their executioner. 120,000 men and horses were packed so tightly into the narrow corridor of Molodi that they couldn't turn their mounts. They were trampling each other, their bows useless in the cramped, suffocating press of bodies. The scythe of Molodi began to swing. It wasn't a battle anymore, it was a harvest. The Russian infantry worked through the mass of panicked riders with the methodical efficiency of butchers. The Pakhra River, once a tactical boundary, became a watery grave as thousands of fleeing Tatars tried to swim the marshy banks, only to be dragged down by their armor or shot by stealthy marksmen lining the shore. Devlet-Giray, seeing his empire dissolving into the mud, fled the field with only a fraction of his guard. He left behind his sons, his generals, and the pride of the Crimean Khanate. Of the 120,000 who had ridden north to erase Russia, barely 20,000 would survive the long, hollow journey back to the south. The Ottoman janissaries, the elite heart of the Sultan's power, were virtually wiped from existence. As the sun set over the killing fields, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a graveyard that stretched for miles. Mikhail Vorotinsky stood among the splintered remains of the guliai-gorod, his armor caked in a mixture of soot and blood. He had done the impossible. He had used crude timber and black powder to break the greatest horseman on earth. Russia was not dead. It had been forged anew in the furnace of Molodi. The threat of the Great Horde, which had hung over the Slavic lands for centuries, was shattered forever. Ivan IV would go on to be remembered for his madness and his cruelty, but the survival of his kingdom rested on the wooden walls of a wandering city and the iron will of a prince he had once tried to destroy. The world would eventually forget the name Molodi, but the earth there would never forget the taste of the fire that saved a nation. If you enjoy dark untold history, subscribe because we uncover what others won't.